Hello there, it's Tom and Magnolia here for Gunnerkrigg Court, Chapter 79, Find Yourself.
Hi there.
So at the beginning of this chapter, we're back with Zimmy, and she's running around having a hard time, as she usually does. And pretty quickly she comes across the two Annies and Renard.
And at this point in the story, Renard is still pretty freaked out by Zimmy, right?
Yeah, he is. You can sort of see it in this last panel here. Mm-hmm. But I guess before we go too far into it, this chapter as a whole, I was intended to be a lot bigger than what it actually came out to be, if that makes sense. I was hoping it was a bit more of a grander chapter, and I think the chapter in its entirety didn't quite match the expectations that I'd set for it, and I think that's something that I'll go into as we continue with it.
Can I comment on how you were having a hard time with it and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
I remember at this time you were... I like the chapter, but I remember at this time you were really struggling with it and trying to figure out how best to show what you're trying to show. I just remember that.
Yeah, and I'll try and sort of work that stuff in, because I think looking back or remembering working on this, a lot of the trouble that I was having was probably due to external things, not necessarily the plot of the comic, but then that sort of manifested in a way to me having trouble with figuring out some of the plot points and actually accomplishing with the chapter what I had initially set out to do. But I think a lot of that is more towards the end of the chapter, and I guess we'll talk about that stuff when we get to it.
Sure.
But for now, this is going to be a chapter with Zimmy and Annie, or the Annies, I guess. And it's always fun to have them together. But I guess it seems that Gamma is strangely missing from this. And so we see that Zimmy's running around because she's being chased by these three elf kids, and they seem to be being pretty harsh on her.
It kind of seems like they are like Renard in that they can innately sense that there's something weird about her.
Oh yeah, definitely, yeah. Because in a way, all the people from the forest are sort of in tune a little bit with the ether, and they can tell that Zimmy is weird, and aside from everybody sort of being able to tell that, it seems like just her presence and the sight of her is kind of strange and off-putting to them.
But I do like that the elf kids are kind of just normal kids also.
Oh yeah, they are. And when I was designing these kids and their outfits, I wanted to look like they have a mixture of their outfits that they might wear in the forest, but then also some new clothes that they probably would have been provided in the court, and sometimes their ensemble doesn't match, for example, or they're a bit haphazard, like they're just wearing whatever,
Sure.
But either way, they've been chasing her down, and they're making some strange allegations that she's been acting weird.
Are those allegations that strange? I mean,
No,
I'm not
they're
saying
not.
Zimmy
Yeah.
deserves to be chased, but
No, I guess they're not that weird, but we'll sort of get into what they mean a bit later.
Sure.
But there's a fourth one behind him and jumps on Zimmy and grabs her. And one thing that Zimmy very much dislikes is to be touched by somebody, I guess. so this doesn't go well for him. And it thrusts them into our old favourite place, Zimmy's internal sort of weird world. So we've been here a few times, and one of the things that's very common that happens when people get thrust in here is that they might get separated from people that are nearby, and that seems to have happened here, but at least the two Annies are there with Renard as well.
It's funny that they're kind of used to it by now. They're like, oh my god.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And here we see a bit more that Renard is perhaps not very comfortable with the situation.
It's pretty cute.
And we hear a little bit from Renard about why he's scared of him. And I guess just a quick note of detail. Some of the backgrounds for this area are... One of the reasons why I like drawing this part of Zimmy's mind is because I get to use old reference from Birmingham, where I used to live. And a lot of the parts that the kids are sort of hanging around here don't actually exist anymore. There were all areas of Fletcher's Walk in the centre of Birmingham that were torn down when they tore down the Central Library and the overpass that goes over the Queensway. And so it's just nice to, I don't know, draw these scenes again, because they're areas that I'd never be able to visit or see again,
And that's kind of an aspect of Zimmy's world too, that it's stuff that isn't around anymore.
Yeah, kind of. It's all bits and pieces that are sort of brought back from her memory and where she used to live and sort of given physical form, but that doesn't make them any more solid, I guess. Things are liable to change in this environment very quickly and distort and get all weird. And there are a few elements here that we haven't seen in a while, like the fact that there are these sort of weird nobodies, I guess, walking around with the strange markings sort of flowing off their faces, and the fact that Annie is able to dispel them just by touching them. Because of that, luckily, Annie is able to come to the rescue of these elf kids who are pretty surprised about what's going on.
Yeah.
And they quite rightly accuse Zimmy being the one to have caused all this. But they also don't really understand that it's not really her fault, because she's not fully in control of things like this, and Annie's trying to explain that.
Yeah, and they're also starting to be affected by Zimmy themselves in weird ways.
Yeah, that's right.
And it seems like Zimmy's personal self-hatred is more of a focus in this chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that's actually something that comes out a lot in this sort of internal world, but here it's definitely affecting the kids. And really the whole world is just like a product of her internal feelings of herself and her self-image, that kind of thing.
I remember at this point when you were writing these pages, you were a little starting to get concerned about these scenes being repetitive to earlier Zimmy scenes.
Yeah, a little bit, and that is the thing that I try and keep in mind when I am reintroducing things that have been introduced in the comic but then not touched on for a long time. And so I think it is worthwhile bringing that stuff back, but not in a way that if you're reading it all in one go, that it would seem like you are just treading over old ground. So here I tried to make it more that Annie is giving information that the reader may already know, but in a perspective that is perhaps slightly different. You know?
Yeah.
So they're boiling it down to saying things like, well, strange things happen here, which is pretty obvious. But then I can have Renard interject and say that the distortions can visually alter what you're seeing and stuff. And it also lets Annie push through to the next plot point, which is that to get out of the situation, generally in the past, they have to find Gamma, the girl that Zimmy would have been with. But it turns out that these kids didn't see Zimmy with another girl. And they start making weird accusations that she was crawling around like a spider and being all weird and strange.
I guess to be fair to them, if you did see a girl crawling around like a spider with weird eyes like that, you probably would assume that it was aggressive in some way.
Sure, I guess so, if it was true, yeah.
So they seem like jerks here, but also, I guess if you look at things from their perspective, if you had no idea who Zimmy was, and there was just some girl crawling on the wall with fangs looking at you, I would probably, I don't know, I probably wouldn't just say, hey, what's up?
It'd probably put you on edge.
Yeah.
But so after having regrouped, they set off to try and find either the toy shop or a tall tower where Zimmy was last time they were in this world, which would have been in the Torn Sea. And we see that Zimmy is still somehow affecting the kids.
And she doesn't even seem to appreciate that Annie's a bit nicer to her either.
Sure, yeah. And that's just a look at her sort of internal monologues,
And you can start to notice there's something going on behind the panels here, too.
That's right, yeah. Even on the previous page. And some readers pointed it out, and they sort of assumed it was just a graphical error, which sometimes happens in my comic, but that's what I was hoping.
Yeah.
And it looks like there's kind of something behind the panels, and then in this page, you can definitely see that there's somebody back there, somebody familiar. And as the scene with the kids continues, I use this as a transition to basically follow the events of the story, but from somebody else's point of view, and that's Gamma. To everyone else, she's lost, but it's because she's just floating behind the panels in this sort of black space. And we see that it's not just Gamma who's lost behind the panels here. Renard also seems to be here, even though we've been seeing him and watching him interact with the people up to this point.
So the one who's with them is not the real Renard then?
That's what Gamma reveals here. She reveals that pretty much all the people that they're looking at are not even the real people that they're supposed to be. And in fact, they are all parts of either Antimony or Zimmy herself, because as Gamma describes it, she's just having a bit of trouble. And I wanted this to show one way in which the sort of delusions and the kind of uncontrollable powers that Zimmy has can manifest in a way that it's kind of tough to explain, it's not just that she causes strange things to happen or that she sees weird things, but it is all that, but it's more, and it sort of causes this very strange and scary sort of introspective loop that she gets stuck in sometimes.
And this page kind of confirms that those elf kids weren't even really chasing her?
That's right, yeah. That event is just another memory. So she's sort of overlaying a memory of when she was chased a long time ago and putting them onto the image of these kids. So
maybe she saw them and made her think of that, and then it caused it to happen again, even though they didn't really do that. So they weren't even really being jerks. Exactly,
that's right, yeah. So up until now, it's almost like we've seen these kids, but we don't actually know if they are real, really. They could be just as fake as anything else going on in this environment.
But Gamma says here that she does this because she thinks she deserves to live it over and over, basically.
That's right, and that is one of the things that Zimmy's situation causes her to put up with, is this sort of internal world that she constructs for herself is made of, not only her her self-perceptions, but also what she assumes people think of her, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And she is, I guess you could say, pretty pessimistic. And she's pretty scared and paranoid of the world and the people around her, so this is the world that she constructs for herself. But all Gamma and Renard can do while they're floating around here is just observe and hope that the kids go in the right direction.
But it's nice that Renard gets to actually spend time with Gamma and hopefully see that Gamma and Zimmy aren't so terrible, I guess.
Exactly, yeah. Like, up until now, Renard has never shown any sort of animosity or fear of Gamma. It's just been Zimmy. So here, it's one of the rare occasions where somebody can actually talk to Gamma without Zimmy being around. And in this area, of course, I guess is a small detail, there is no, like, language barrier. You know, they're just sort of thinking to each other.
Gamma sure puts up with a lot.
She does, yeah. But anyway, as they're watching, the Annies do actually find the old toy store where they found Gamma in all those chapters ago. And unfortunately, the Annies stumble into a vision that shocks them, really, something they weren't expecting.
I know that you weren't super happy with this chapter, but I think this moment especially is very nice and it looks both very warm and also very sad and scary.
Yeah, it's supposed to be very weird, I guess, to put it simply. And this whole scene here is basically to illustrate the two different sides of Annie, the sides that she's been struggling internally herself. It seems like the Annie, I guess, that we know as the one from the forest is very practical, and she realizes that it's an illusion, so she has to dispel it straight away.
Right.
Whereas the Annie from the court is very upset, and she wanted to, linger on the image of her mother.
And it's also the first time in a while we've seen the two Annies get angry at each other. Yeah,
they've been on pretty good terms for a while, but them being split physically is still, I guess a metaphor for the problems that she's been having. And I was hoping this chapter was going to be one where I look at that and then bring it to a close, And as we're getting towards the end of the chapter, that part of the story is what's going to be covered.
It's a smaller thing, but I also think this thing with Renard is really interesting, that they still seem to have an image of him as like crying over Surma and clinging, that he's sort of surprised to see him this way. To me, it indicates they still kind of have an issue with that Renard was in love with their mom.
Well, a little bit, but also keep in mind that what they're looking at isn't always necessarily just part of the subject. Like, it's not just Renard, it's also a little bit of antimony that we're seeing here.
Yeah.
And as Gamma says, that everything that's going on is being influenced by Zimmy's hatred. So it's all been mixed together and then given an extra helping of, like, Zimmy's particular animosity and hatred,
Yeah.
So everything is extremely exaggerated. But yeah, there is still that aspect of their history and their relationship. And we get a little hint of the fact that Zimmy may have done something to feel that she deserves all this stuff happening to her sometime a long time ago, before she was even in the comic.
And we don't really have any inkling of what that might be.
No, not yet. So that could be something that we explore with Zimmy in the future. Though it does seem to hinge on this internal philosophy that Zimmy has, where she questions, does a truly terrible person deserve happiness? And I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question. Either way, it's directly affecting the way that the Annies are interacting with each other. And we can see here that Gamma very succinctly points out that, well, the problem that Annie's having is the sort of internal struggle she has between clinging to or letting go of the memory of her mother. And Renard points out, well, can't you just do both? Which, yeah, if it was that simple, that would be the answer.
And Gamma says we all have this inside us, different struggles of what to cling to and what to let go of.
Not even just clinging to or letting go of things, but just struggles in general. You know, and they can come in many forms. And just briefly, Gamma mentions that Zimmy is still kind of terrified of Cat. Despite them being able to recognize that Cat has been put on a better path, I guess, with Annie's intervention and following the events of the previous book.
Sure.
But during all this, they then get interrupted by this fourth guy, who seems to be missing from the rest of the kids. And they kind of sit back, and Gamma instructs Renard to just observe and kind of get a little peek into his internal monologues.
So this is really his thoughts then?
Yes, that's right. So there are elements of the kids like floating around amongst all this, amongst what's happening.
It's like all their brains got squished together.
Yeah, pretty much. And he's able to kind of see the kids, wandering around and looking for him, and his thoughts are basically like leaking out, and Gamma and Renard are able to hear them. And you can kind of see that the biggest concerns that this guy has right now are just, regular everyday concerns that young kids have. And I guess in this particular instance, he's just thinking about how, I guess he kind of fancies Lise.
And would you say these are things that Zimmy wishes were her concerns, or things that she sees other people being concerned about and wishes that she worried about things like that too?
No, not really. I'd say that it's probably closer that because these concerns are more everyday and stuff, that it's not been factored into the world that she's constructed. Like here, where Gamma and Renard are, they're sort of separate to that, and they're observing, and also are these kind of mundane thoughts that are just regular everyday thoughts that Zimmy's sort of dismissed and put outside of this terrible nightmare world that she's constructed.
I see.
So this kid Tam is just struggling with his own internal dilemma of fancying his friend's sister, I guess. And that's about as far as his troubles go. But this does lead Gamma to identify that this is her opportunity to pull Zimmy out of this loop that she's got herself stuck in. And Zimmy airs her concerns that she has about the court.
So last time we saw Zimmy, she felt pretty content about her place in the court and that they were leaving her alone. So this is indicating that's changed pretty severely.
It's not that. It's not that she's really worried about their direct intervention, but there is something going on that is disturbing her, and I think what scares her most is that she has no idea what it is and what it's going to lead to. And the biggest concern that Zimmy has in general is anything that would interfere with her relationship with Gamma. She, right from the start, she's always been. I've always tried to show her concerned with somebody trying to take Gamma away from her.
Yeah,
and that is what leads her to get stuck in these situations, I suppose. But one thing that I wanted to draw out here, and I feel that I was able to illustrate, was that because Renard was able to see this kind of inner view of both Zimmy and Gamma, that he was able to sort of understand a bit better the life that she leads, I guess.
Yeah. And
come to the understanding that Zimmy's outward hostility isn't always a reflection of her animosity towards somebody. It seems to be completely internal, and sometimes it emanates out from her, and his worries and fear of her are sort of assuaged a little bit.
So Zimmy says she knows something that could help Carver understand herself a little better. Could she have done this at any moment, basically? No, not really. And that is, I think, one of the things that I didn't do so great with this chapter. I guess one of the things that I kind of wanted to imply that what's going on here, and of course this thing that will help Annie understand herself better, is to be merged again. Obviously spoiler warning, I guess, for something that's about to happen in a couple pages. But really, it only is able to happen because they're coming out of this nightmare world that Zimmy constructs. And without this, she would not have been able to actively snap her fingers and then combine the two Annies. But that is a side effect of them having been in this situation. It's kind of like when she comes out of it and she meets up with Gamma, everything is basically sorted back into their proper places. So as they sort of zap back out, we see that Zimmy wasn't climbing up the walls and grimacing at the kids and stuff. She was just looking at them. She was just sitting nearby and observing the kids, some of the human kids and the elf kids just playing football. Do you think she even felt resentful that they're all playing football and having fun, and that's why she kind of created this image?
Probably not.
Not really?
I think just seeing the kids probably just caused her to remember some bad things, and that coupled with the fear that she has with whatever it is that the court is doing, and there was probably some trigger that set her off, but not necessarily that just looking at them having fun, because Zimmy is perfectly content to stay away from everyone else if it means she can just be with Gamma.
Right, okay.
She doesn't want to go down there and play goalie or whatever. She, wants nothing to do with them. It's just that in this case, she was looking at them. And here I wanted to show that Lise, Kellen, Tam, and Rob were the kids that were down there. They haven't even really seen Zimmy. They're just people that Zimmy saw from afar, and then she constructed these artifices out of them, I guess, and they were present then inside her mind, illustrating the worst possible feelings that she has towards herself, but in physical form.
They didn't even do anything wrong. They're just
minding
their own business.
Yeah, they're completely unaware of Zimmy's existence. They weren't chasing her. They didn't see her crawling around like a spider. They weren't going to beat her up. So it's all internally fabricated by I guess Zimmy's animosity towards her own self.
Do you think if you could do this again, you would explain a little bit more what exactly Zimmy did?
That I don't think is the part that I have a problem with. The part that I think that I did have a problem with, that I was struggling with in this chapter, was like I mentioned before, trying to explain without explaining this whole thing about how everything gets jumbled up in Zimmy's world, and then as things get sorted back, one of the things that gets sorted is the fact that Annie is kind of in disarray as well.
Yeah.
So she's been sort of split by Loop into two beings, but once all that is put into this big blender of Zimmy's brain, and everything gets pushed back, what comes out on the other end is what Annie is supposed to be, which is this sort of duality of the two sides of herself that are constantly quarreling, and because they're separate in physical terms, the court Annie and the forest Annie, she couldn't come to an understanding. But the thing that Zimmy was able to do in deconstructing this world is bring them two together, so that the two sides of Annie can live as one, basically.
Well, I did think it made sense when I read the chapter, but hearing you explain it that way, it does add an extra dimension to it.
Yeah, and I guess I just didn't do a good job of illustrating that without maybe having Renard come up and say, "Oh, I guess what happened is that Zimmy's mind was able to put the two of you back together." Something very on the nose like that, because I did want the end of the chapter to be kind of almost wordless, and Renard's explanation is something that we, the reader, don't need to hear, and Annie doesn't really need to hear from him. She kind of understands inherently what just happened, which is that she was made whole again from having been separated.
But you still struggle with how this came out, though.
Yeah, I did. I was pretty unhappy with the chapter by the time I'd finished it. And I guess going back to the stuff that I mentioned before, I think it was literally just at this point, where were we? Well, we're like a year and a half into the lockdowns and stuff. And I guess my living situation obviously was very different at the time, because I'd just come to America, and I was only really able to experience living there for about a year before everything was essentially shut down. And we were living in a fairly small apartment at the time, and while that was fine for the first year and a half or so, one of the things I wasn't able to do was, one thing that I did all the time was, every week I start the week by leaving the house and going somewhere and planning out what I'm going to do that week, planning the pages or writing a new chapter, that kind of thing. Because I couldn't even do that really where we were. After a while, it started to wear on me a little bit, and I hadn't been able to see family for almost 3 years at that time, and it seemed like there was not much of an end in sight, and I guess one of the things was the apartment that we were in, we were only supposed to be there for a year before we started looking for a bigger place to live, and we had to put all those plans on hold.
Right, and I was going to work, so I was leaving the house every day, but you were in the house all day.
Sure, and working solitary is fine by me. I prefer that, actually. But there was a difference between choosing to stay at home, for example, versus not having the option to leave and be able to get away from the computer, or get away from the distractions you might have in your office or around your house, that kind of thing. And it certainly felt like it was affecting the comic in a way where I wasn't able to, collect my thoughts, I guess, or put them together in a way that helped me work on the chapters, and I really felt like I wasn't doing my best work. And I think that was coming through in the work, and I think the readers were kind of picking up on it. And in this chapter in particular, I think a lot of people were kind of picking up that it might not have been portrayed in the best possible way, Well,
I do think you're always pretty hard on yourself, but I saw that you were struggling, and that it wasn't coming as easily to you as it normally does. So I hope that you're feeling better about things now.
And there were long stretches of time where I just couldn't figure out how to draw a single panel, for example.
Yeah.
When you see the chapter put all together, you don't, and I don't really see those pauses in productivity, which is the advantage of having finished work to look back on. But I do remember there, some individual specific pages or panels were kind of tough to get through, and I suppose one of the saving graces of having the 3-day-a-week schedule, which I have not, fallen behind on, and the buffer that I have, is that it really, when it gets down to the wire, I just have to do something. I have to finish the page and I have to push forward. And so while that helps my updating schedule stay consistent, it may unfortunately lead to some areas of the comic not being as developed or polished as I would have liked.
Well, you could always go back and mess with stuff if you really wanted to, but I think the chapter came out all right.
I think the problem is that if I was to try and go back and rework a chapter that has been completed like this, it would require some major reworking of the chapter in entirety. It's not a matter of, say, redrawing a panel or two like I might do if ever I was to go back and redraw some of the early pages. I could redraw a panel here, a panel there, or we maybe rework a whole page, but still keep the same structure. Whereas here it was the structural problems with the chapter, I think, that were coming through.
Still, I think you got your point across.
I think it did eventually come across, and I know that the readers were able to discern what it was that I was putting across.
Yeah.
I think I was just a little disappointed. I was hoping that I could have constructed a bit grander of a chapter than what I eventually made.
Yeah.
But I guess there's not much more to do than to push forward. and
this was a nice page.
Yeah, this bonus page was something that I'd been planning for a very long time, which is that when Annie comes to term with like her feelings about her mom and her memories and stuff, is that she takes the makeup that she's been wearing and she puts it in her drawer and she puts it away. And I knew for a very long time that there was going to be a moment where Annie just stops wearing her makeup.
That was the thing you told me when we first met.
Yeah,
that there would be a point where she would stop, and I thought it was when her father came back, but that's not really the point.
No, it's when she's come to a place of acceptance with the memories of her mother, and I guess the makeup was just a visual reminder the entire time that she always had, the thoughts of her mom first and foremost. It's kind of the first thing you see when you look at Annie. Beside the girl, you see the strange makeup she's wearing.
Yeah.
And here, because she was able to come to this understanding between the two sides of her, she comes to the understanding that she can keep the memory, but she doesn't have to cling to it to a fault.
Yeah.
And she doesn't also have to completely forget about it, and that's what she's learned, and that's what Zimmy was able to provide out of this nightmare, like hellscape that they were in.
Well, like I said, I think it ends on a nice note.
Yeah, I think it does, and it does ultimately do what I wanted to do plot-wise. So even if I'm not fully happy with the chapter, it's when I go back and read it, it is better than I feel a bit better about it than when I was working on it.
Good.
So,
I'm glad. Yeah.
So
you should.
So it's done, and I just continue. And speaking of, that is that. And come back again for chapter 80, The Mind Cage.
Bye.